This presentation explains the legal process used by the Kentucky Public Service Commission to review the applications filed by utilities seeking to increase rates, and provides an overview of the pending Kentucky Power Company rate case, including both a summary of the application and the procedural schedule. As with all other matters under PSC jurisdiction, rate making is a legal process. It is governed by statutes enacted by the Kentucky General Assembly and by PSC regulations derived from those statutes. Also applicable are legal precedents set forth in PSC orders and in court decisions regarding the application of PSC statutes and regulations. The guiding principle in Kentucky statutes regarding rates is that they must be fair, just, and reasonable. Those terms are not defined in law, but their general meaning has been established over time through precedents and legal interpretation. In applying the statutes, the PSC seeks always to strike a balance between the interests of a utility and its customers. State law also says that shareholders in an investor-owned utility are entitled to an opportunity to earn a return on equity. Equity is generally understood to be the net value of the shareholder investment, in other words, the value of the utility's assets less the amount of debt attached to those assets. Note that the shareholders have only an opportunity, not a guarantee, of earning a return on equity. The appropriate level of return on equity is determined by evaluating the level of investment risks for a utility, a comparison to similar utilities, and other factors. The rate of return is at a level that will permit the utility to attract investment capital at competitive rates. Determining rates is a two-part process. It involves calculating a revenue requirement and then establishing a rate design. We will look at those parts of the process in detail after a review of the process the PSC uses to review rate case applications. Utilities must give the PSC at least 30 days notice before filing an application to adjust rates. They also must give public notice to their customers when applying for a rate change. The procedural clock starts running when the application is filed and determined by the PSC staff to meet all filing requirements. An application cannot be acted upon until it is complete. The applied for rates cannot go into effect until 30 days after the application is filed. However, in practice, the PSC may, and usually does, suspend the rates for 5 or 6 months to allow for a thorough review. If the PSC does not issue a decision before the suspension period ends, the utility may put the rates into effect pending a final decision. But if the PSC ultimately grants rates lower than those requested, the utility must refund the overcollection to customers with interest. The PSC has 10 months from the time the application is filed to complete its consideration of the rate application. Once a final order is issued, any requests for reconsideration must be filed within 23 days of the order. Interveners are parties other than the utility that play a formal role in the proceedings before the PSC. By law, only the Kentucky Attorney General has the absolute right to intervene in cases before the PSC. Kentucky statutes designate the Attorney General as the representative of ratepayers as a whole. Other parties may petition the PSC to become interveners. In order to be granted full intervention, a party must show that it represents a unique interest not represented by the Attorney General, and that it will be able to bring forth evidence that might not otherwise come to the attention of the PSC. Parties granted full intervention are allowed to introduce testimony, ask written questions of the applicant and other parties, and participate in the cross-examination when the PSC holds its formal evidentiary hearing in a case. Examples of parties granted full intervention include groups representing interests such as large industrial customers, low-income residential customers, and environmental advocacy groups. The PSC on rare occasions has granted limited intervention. Limited interveners participate in the hearing, but do not present evidence, put on testimony, or engage in pre-hearing discovery. Parties may seek intervention once a utility gives notice that it will file a rate application. The application includes direct testimony by witnesses who will appear at any hearing held by the PSC. Just like direct testimony in a court proceeding, this pre-filed testimony is taken under oath, and any perjury is subject to penalties under the law. The same is true of any testimony filed by interveners. After the application is filed, there may be one or more rounds of written questions, known as data requests, between the parties. The PSC staff also files data requests. Responses to data requests are made under oath. The PSC is not required to conduct local meetings solely for the purpose of taking public comment, but may do so at its discretion. With or without public meetings, public comments are always welcome and will go into the case record for the Commission's consideration. They may be submitted by mail, fax, email, or through the PSC website. Detailed information on how to submit comments is provided at the end of this presentation. An evidentiary hearing is not required, but is customarily held in major rate cases. It is conducted much like a court proceeding. Although testimony is usually filed in writing in advance, witnesses appear under oath and are subject to cross-examination by counsel for other parties, by the PSC staff, and by the commissioners themselves. In complex cases, hearings may last several days. All PSC hearings are open to the public and are webcast on the PSC website. After a hearing is concluded, the PSC may ask for additional evidence or for briefs from the parties summarizing their positions. The PSC then takes the case under advisement. Decisions are rendered in writing in the form of a final order. A decision requires agreement by at least 2 of the 3 commissioners. Parties to a rate case sometimes propose full or partial settlements in advance of the PSC hearing. When that occurs, the PSC will conduct a hearing on the proposed settlement and all other issues presented in a case. A full settlement must be unanimous. In other words, all parties to the case must agree on all the issues in the case. However, partial settlements are permitted. In such cases, all parties agree on one or more issues, or most parties agree on all issues, leaving the PSC to resolve the remaining points of contention. Although a settlement typically leads to a streamlined hearing, since the parties have agreed on most or all issues, it does not reduce the level of scrutiny the PSC applies to a case. The PSC will fully analyze the rates and other terms of the settlement and will fully review the settlement during the hearing. In order to accept a settlement, the PSC must determine whether the proposed rates meet the test of being fair, just, and reasonable. The PSC has the power to accept, reject, or modify all or parts of a proposed settlement. Certain utility expenses are not included in the revenue requirement and thus are not included in base rates. For electric utilities such as Kentucky Power, these typically include fuel costs above or below the amount included in base rates. These appear as a separate surcharge or credit on the bill. Environmental compliance costs related to the use of coal. These also appear on the bill as a surcharge. Energy efficiency programs. These costs are also recovered as a surcharge. Surcharges to pay for special programs such as assistance for low-income customers or economic development activities. Surcharges to recover other costs that are not in base rates or that may be temporary. And costs assessed by other entities, such as city or county franchise fees or local taxes. Now we will examine the 2 major components of any rate case, determining how much revenue a utility should be allowed to collect and how that revenue will be allocated through the rates paid by various customer classes. The revenue requirement is the total revenue a utility needs to maintain safe and reliable service and financial stability, and, in the case of investor-owned companies, offer its shareholders the opportunity to earn a reasonable rate of return on equity. Revenue requirement is based on a 12-month period known as a test year. If it is a backward-looking or historic test year, the 12-month period must end no more than 3 months before the filing date of the application and uses actual financial information for that period. Forward-looking or forecasted test years are prospective 12-month periods that begin at the end of the suspension period. Because forecasted test years are more complex and require more review, the suspension period mentioned earlier is 6 rather than 5 months. To calculate a revenue requirement, the first step is to determine a utility's allowable expenses. These include routine construction, equipment and material purchases, operational costs including maintenance, billing, customer service, and others, personnel costs such as salaries and benefits, the cost of major construction projects once they go into service, and any borrowing costs. Certain expenses are excluded from the revenue requirement. Advertising for promotional purposes is excluded by law. Executive bonuses, employee gifts, and similar expenses are not allowed. Charitable donations and club memberships also are excluded. The PSC also has broad discretion to exclude any expense it deems to be unreasonable. Unusual or one-time costs or revenue are excluded from the test year so that they do not distort the revenue requirement. They are instead accounted for separately and spread out over time. For example, unusually high storm recovery costs during a test year would artificially increase the revenue requirement, since those costs are not incurred on an annual basis. Therefore, they may be excluded. Revenue from asset sales also may be excluded. The final revenue requirement includes all of the allowable expenses and a calculation that sets the rate of return at the appropriate level for investor-owned utilities. The return on equity calculation is based upon a utility's capital structure, including the amount of debt it is carrying and the value of the existing shareholder investment. The cost of any debt is calculated based on the terms and interest rates of that debt. Also examined is the level of risk attached to the utility. The rate of return must be set at a level that enables the utility to attract sufficient capital investment to provide for financial stability and reliable provision of service. To determine an appropriate potential rate of return, the PSC examines all of the factors noted above and also looks at the rates of return granted to utilities of similar size and operating characteristics. The PSC then sets the targeted level of return on equity at a figure that will enable the utility to attract investment capital at the lowest possible interest rates, while balancing that against the impact of higher electric rates on the utility's customers. The return on equity then determines how much revenue the utility is permitted to collect in excess of its reasonable and allowed operating costs. That final number is the revenue requirement. Once a revenue requirement has been calculated, the next step is to design the rates. Rate design is the process of allocating costs and revenue to the various rate classes and setting rates accordingly. Rate design also examines the appropriate allocation of rates to recover fixed and variable costs. An electric utility typically has three major customer classes: residential, commercial, and industrial. There also are miscellaneous rate classes that cover services such as street lighting, attachment of communication cables to electric poles, etc. Because commercial and industrial loads vary widely depending on the type of business, those rate classes are typically divided into a large number of service categories based on load characteristics. Residential customers tend to be more uniform, so there are fewer types of service and the vast majority fall into a single rate class. A guiding principle of rate design is that customers receiving the same type of service should pay the same rate. Thus, residential customers receiving simple single-phase service pay the same rate regardless of the square footage of the home, type of construction, type and number of appliances, location in an urban versus a rural area, and so forth. In general, larger customers have a lower cost of service due to economies of scale. It costs less to run and maintain a single line to a large customer than 1,000 lines to 1,000 smaller customers with the same total usage. Among the major customer classes, it is most expensive to serve residential customers, particularly those in rural areas. They tend to have the highest cost of service. As part of a rate application, large utilities such as Kentucky Power must submit a cost of service study that examines, in great detail, the cost of serving the various customer classes. It also evaluates fixed versus variable costs for each customer class. The PSC uses cost of service analysis as a guideline, but rates are not set strictly in accordance with the cost of service. Thus, large industrial customers, even if they pay lower rates than residential customers, typically pay rates higher than their cost of service would indicate. Conversely, while residential rates are typically higher than those for commercial or industrial customers, they may nonetheless not be high enough to fully recover the cost of service. Similarly, the fixed portion of the bill, the monthly service charge, may not fully recover the non-variable costs of providing service. The fixed costs, those that are independent of consumption, are the basis for the monthly service charge. Those fixed costs include functions such as billing, customer service, and line maintenance, as well as equipment costs and employee salaries and benefits. Variable costs generally are tied in some way to power production and include the baseline cost of fuel, many power plant operating costs, and similar items. Historically, the monthly service charge has not recovered all fixed costs. The consumption charge, the amount paid per kilowatt hour used, has recovered the variable costs as well as a portion of the fixed costs. The PSC typically does some rebalancing of rates in each rate case, both in terms of allocating revenue across classes to more closely reflect costs and recovering a larger portion of fixed costs through the fixed charge. But those adjustments are done in small increments in keeping with the PSC's long-standing policy of gradualism in moving toward fully balanced rates. In deciding on a final rate design, the PSC considers a number of issues. How much subsidization across rate classes is acceptable? This most often means deciding to what extent larger customers should pay some of the costs of serving residential customers. With respect to allocating fixed versus variable costs, the PSC must consider whether higher fixed charges are unduly burdensome on low-income ratepayers. Also at issue is whether setting a higher fixed charge discourages energy efficiency and is unfair to customers who have taken steps to reduce their electric consumption. The bottom line for the PSC is always to fulfill the statutory requirement that rates be fair, just, and reasonable. That means that they have to be fair to a utility's investors and high enough to support safe and reliable service, but, to the greatest extent possible, should not be unduly burdensome on ratepayers. However, rates cannot be set so low that they deprive investors of a reasonable opportunity to earn a fair rate of return on equity. The Supreme Court of the United States has deemed such low rates to be confiscatory and thus illegal. The PSC has discretion as to how it sets rates, but only within well-established legal limits. So, at the end of the process, it comes down to a balancing act that weighs the attractiveness of low rates against the need to provide sufficient revenue to support adequate service, permit a utility to be financially stable, and offer shareholders a legally required opportunity to earn a fair rate of return, and also considers the impacts of rate design on a utility's various ratepayer classes. Now let's turn to Case 2017-00179, the application of Kentucky Power Company for a rate adjustment. Kentucky Power last received a rate increase in June of 2015. In that case, the utility reached a settlement with the other parties that set a revenue increase that was about 60% of the amount originally requested by the utility. The settlement increased the average monthly bill for the average residential ratepayer by about $7.36. In addition, Kentucky Power agreed to drop its legal challenge to an earlier PSC decision that disallowed $54 million in fuel charges and ordered the company to refund $13 million it had already collected from ratepayers, as well as forego collection of an additional $41 million. The PSC modified the settlement by altering the allocation of increases to the fixed and variable charges. It decreased the fixed charge while increasing the per kilowatt-hour charge from the levels in the settlement. The overall increase remained the same for an average residential customer. In the current case, Kentucky Power is seeking to increase annual revenue from base rates by $63.3 million, or about 15%. The company originally asked for nearly $70 million in increases, but reduced the amount when it was able to refinance some loans at a lower interest rate. Kentucky Power is requesting a targeted rate of return on equity of 10.3%. In requesting the increase, Kentucky Power cited declining revenue due to the loss of load from customers who have either reduced consumption or no longer receive service. With the declining revenue, Kentucky Power said a rate increase is needed to recover its costs and maintain a reasonable rate of return for shareholders. Key elements of the application include an increase in the monthly service charge for residential and other customers, an increase in the per kilowatt-hour consumption charge, an increase in the environmental surcharge, which recovers environmental compliance costs related to the use of coal, a flow-through to customers of $6.2 million in savings from reduced vegetation management costs, elimination of a discount on power for utility employees, increasing the Home Energy Assistance Program monthly surcharge by 5 cents, which also would increase the shareholder contribution that matches the money from ratepayers, a 10-cent increase in the monthly charge to fund economic development activities, with a matching increase in shareholder funds, eliminating the current surcharges or riders for Kentucky Power's acquisition of a 50% share of the Mitchell Generating Plant in Moundsville, West Virginia, and for the recently completed conversion of the smaller of 2 units at the Big Sandy plant in Louisa to burn natural gas instead of coal. Those costs would be rolled into base rates. The confusingly named Big Sandy Retirement Rider, which was unrelated to retirement costs for utility employees, would remain, but would be redesignated as the Big Sandy Decommissioning Rider to better reflect the fact that it is recovering costs related to the shutdown of the larger unit at the Big Sandy plant. Based on numbers provided by Kentucky Power, here is how the rate changes, if approved in full, would affect the average residential customer. The estimate is based on an average usage over the course of a full year of 1,247 kilowatt hours per month. A kilowatt hour is the amount of electricity needed to keep a 100-watt light bulb lit for 10 hours. The monthly charge would increase from $11 to $17.50. The charge per kilowatt hour would increase from about 8.8 cents to more than 10.8 cents. When the changes to and elimination of various surcharges are combined with those increases, Kentucky Power estimates that the total average monthly residential bill will go from the current $142.20 to nearly $163, a net increase of about $20.80 or nearly 15%. Keep in mind that this is an overall figure for all residential customers over a 12-month period as estimated by Kentucky Power, and individual amounts could be larger or smaller depending on individual usage and circumstances. 7 parties representing a variety of interests have been granted intervention by the PSC into this proceeding. The Kentucky Office of Attorney General is representing the ratepayers as a whole, while other interveners are representing specific interests, as listed on this slide. The PSC denied 4 requests for intervention that did not meet the legal requirements for full participation in the case. On July 17th, when the application was submitted, the PSC suspended the proposed rates until January 18th. On that date, Kentucky Power could put them into effect subject to refund. If the company does so and the PSC ultimately approves lower rates, Kentucky Power would have to refund the difference back to customers with interest. The PSC held a hearing on requests for intervention on July 24th. A video of that hearing is available on the PSC website, as are the application and all records in the case. The web address is psc.ky.gov. No other requests for intervention are pending. The PSC is holding 3 public meetings to present information to and take comments from the public. The evidentiary hearing in this case, at which Kentucky Power and the interveners will present their cases and cross-examine witnesses, will begin at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on December 6th at the PSC offices in Frankfort. It is likely to last 2 or 3 days. The hearing is open to the public and will be streamed live on the PSC website. The suspension period ends January 18th, and the PSC must issue a decision no later than May 18th of 2018. Here is where to send public comments. Include the case number 2017-00179 in your comments to ensure that they are placed into the case file as quickly as possible. For more information, contact Andrew Melnikovich, Communications Director at the Kentucky Public Service Commission.